Hello, good morning, everyone again. Lee Scott came here to help to install works by Martin Reiser and Andrew Hugo of the work A Secret Garden, which is shown upstairs. Lee Scott is a digital artist and programmer based in Bath, England. He is a current doctoral student at Bath University, specializing in the creation of interactive audiovisual environments. In particular, Lee's work interrogates and explores the role of digital technology within opera and has collaborated on several operative projects for the web and the mobile device, including the online opera, The Imaginary Voyage. Let's welcome Lee Scott's presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Min. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to, I think I speak for everyone actually, all the artists. I want to say thank you to all the market team for your hard work over the last week. I mean, the standard of finish is really incredible, and I think we've been kind of blown away with how helpful and hospitable you've all been. So that's my thanks. Okay, so I'm very pleased actually to be here to talk about our interactive installation Secret Garden. The work is a digital opera for iPads. It was conceived by Professor Martin Reiser and Professor Andrew Hugo, and developed and realised technically by myself and the two artists in collaboration. The opera was created at the Institute of Creative Technologies at De Montfort University, and was originally commissioned by the Phoenix Digital Media Centre in Leicester, which is in the UK. So Secret Garden is an attempt to recreate a contemporary version of Eden, of the Eden myth, in the midst of an urban environment. In its current manifestation as a digital installation, it consists of 10 mounted iPads that act as virtual viewports into an idyllic three-dimensional interpretation of the Garden of Eden. By touching the iPad screens, the user triggers a stream of digital dance, text and music that together tell the mythical story of the fall of man, which is a story which is common to many world religions, including Judaism, Christianity and Islam. The story of Adam and Eve and of creation is perhaps one of the oldest and most philosophized texts still in existence. And on one level, the artists are exploring the collision of the old and the new by telling this ancient myth using cutting-edge technologies such as mobile computing, motion capture, and digitally distributed sound. The narrative of Secret Garden is loosely modelled on the Sephirot, or the Tree of Life, which represents the fundamental principles that are central to the Jewish belief system. The Sephirot can be interpreted to describe 10 characteristics of God, which, in a simplified form, include such things as wisdom, understanding, and kindness. Now, the Jewish Kabbalist view, actually, is that the two trees of the Garden of Eden, the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, are in fact alternative perspectives of the Sephirot. The text, therefore, is constructed from 10 poems written by Martin Reiser that examine the notion of choice in a fallen world. And this first poem here is called Glory, and I think I'm going to read it to you, actually. One green, all of a green confounds. My eyes are led through sunlight to a figure dressed in red, walking in the garden. Encircling tread around the serpentine paths, listening for a sound she stands, meeting me she laughs, and drops the flawless apple roundly in my hand, hungry, profound, and human to the core. Now, these poems do not combine to tell one long story in a linear manner, but they rather exist as a series of short vignettes. And this structure means that the user can enter the work at any point. It means they can experience the work in any order, and poems in any order, and enjoy a complete experience of the work, even if they only fulfill a partial viewing. Now, it's rather difficult, actually, to translate Martin and Andrew's thinking to you accurately by proxy, of course. So instead, for this presentation, I think I've chosen to offer an interpretation of the piece from my own perspective as a researcher of digital opera. So first, what on earth is digital opera? Well, for me, the term embodies an attempt to employ digital technologies, that is, digital imaging and audio techniques, mobile computing, web technologies, and so forth, to transform, reconfigure, or redefine the various elements of opera. Such elements include music, particularly the voice, of course, stage design, sonography, and dramatic composition. Now, in recent years, a number of digital operas have been created that, for instance, use the web to connect collaborators across the world, or use sensor technologies, deploy sensor technologies to extend the expressive capacity of the human body. What else is there? Yeah. Actually, there's another line of digital opera is the idea that you use bespoke digital instruments or digital techniques, electroacoustic sound techniques, to question what opera might sound like in the future. So Secret Garden draws on such existing work. However, it also is quite different to them because it's actually conceived solely for digital platforms, for digital presentation. In other words, it has not been written to be performed on a stage at any time. Instead, the opera is an attempt to rely on a long-established and highly traditional form of art, with some of the qualities and practices of digital art, particularly web art. These include, for example, immersion, non-linearity, and the idea that the audience member or participant has some level of control about how the work evolves over time. So, post-humanist desire. I mean, how does Secret Garden relate to post-humanism? You're all nodding at me. Well, I think to start to answer that question, it's quite useful to look towards media theorist Marshall McLuhan, who in the 1960s, I'm sure some of you know Marshall McLuhan, but in the 1960s began writing about how electronic media, and particularly broadcast media, was redefining the human, their social and cultural structures particularly. Now, he talks at length about the discarnate man, or the electronic or disembodied man, who is capable and used to, for example, talking to other humans hundreds of miles away on a telephone. McLuhan's discarnate man deploys media as a technological prosthesis, a way to extend his sight, his sense of sight, his sense of hearing and touch exponentially for the power of electronic technologies. His thinking echoes the notion of transhumanism, of course, or the act of using widely available technologies to enhance physical, intellectual, or even psychological capabilities. Often, this refers to cyborgism and the physical transformation of the human. The discarnate man, however, does not transform himself physically, but extends himself virtually. Now today, this extension of man in the virtual is even more common and even more profound, mainly because of the World Wide Web. The network has given rise to things like chat rooms, Facebook, and Second Life, which enable us not only to extend how far we can see or hear, but to extend our ability to express ourselves artistically, culturally, and even sexually. Now, for me, this post-humanesque notion that digital technologies can extend human expression is key to Secret Garden. The work asks the question, is it possible to translate opera, an art form that relies on multiple forms of human expression, to digital platforms? How compelling would that shift be? How can we digitize the expressive qualities in opera and disseminate them beyond the physical boundaries of the opera house? Can we port them into fictional or otherworldly spaces? To begin to address such questions, we decided that there were two aspects of operatic expression that we needed to retain. The first is movement, specifically dance actually, and the second is the sung voice. We felt we needed a means of digitizing both components so that they remained recognizably human, realistic and immediate. And to achieve this, in terms of representing the digital human form, the dance, Martin Reeser turned to animation, specifically the digital avatar. Welcome 2011 Mac. They don't last very long. There we go. Okay. So his idea was to draw upon the concept of the uncanny, which in art can refer to the creation of highly realistic but often modified representations of the human form. We've seen some examples of this in the show, actually, but there's other people that have been interrogating this idea in depth for quite some time. One is Wendy McMurdo and Tony Ausler. Of course, there's two people there. One of the key features of the uncanny is the blurring of the real and the illusionary. And the reader is aware that the form before them is crafted, that it is fictional. However, they also perceive it to be human-like, familiar, and perhaps even sentient. This is the effect that Martin strives towards with his avatars. So to translate the expressivity and immediacy of human dance to digital figures, we turn to motion capture. We used a Vicon system to digitise the movements of two professional dancers who assume the role of Adam and Eve. The dance itself is choreographed as a series of short improvisations in response to music, which express in a very visceral and spontaneous way the dancer's creative reactions to the emotive qualities of the temporiums. The result is an animated representation of dance that goes some way to capturing the smooth, fluid and delicate nature of the improvised live performance. Once the motion capture was complete, the digital avatars were rendered and placed in the Garden of Eden. To preserve the uncanny, that is both the familiar and the otherworldly nature of the figures, we gave them a skin covered in stars. This positions them as metaphysical beings that symbolise the heavens and the notion of divine creation, which in turn adds to the sense that our digital Eden is indeed a mythical space. I'm going to play you a clip actually of some of the avatars dancing in the Garden of Eden. All being well. So the music of Secret Garden is composed by Professor Andrew Hugel. And his idea was to create a musical environment that evolved according to how many people were interacting with the work at any given time. Therefore, if only one person was present in the space, they would receive a very intimate, personal telling of the story. However, if 10 people are interacting, then the music becomes very multi-layered and quite complex. The installation is therefore interactive not in the sense that people walk in and touch iPads, but in the way that the opera evolves in response to audience engagement. In compositional terms, then, Andrew sets Martin's 10 poems as vocal passages that are accompanied by tuned percussion, such as gongs and kotals. The intention is that not many of them are playing at once, and no matter when they enter the musical landscape is pleasing harmonically. It always sounds right, regardless if there's one sound playing or there's 10. To kind of demonstrate, I've done a small audio application to show you. Let's have a listen to that. I find that really captivating. I've heard it, I must have heard it 400,000 times working on this, but every time it's... Okay. So that's kind of representation of what you might hear in installation. In reality, in fact, the song that you have on your iPad is a little louder, and everything else is kind of in the periphery, actually. But sometimes these lines tend to merge in and sort of cross over to your kind of main focus, and it can be quite compelling. Right, so, like the uncanny nature of the visuals, we wanted the musical landscape to be as immediate and realistic as possible. And the idea was that once the participant placed a pair of headphones on their head, they would enter a new auditory space that felt real, yet far away. In other words, they would be transported to a sound world that exists in parallel to this one. At the same time, though, we wanted the comings and goings of various people interacting with the installation to impact this alternate sound world. The solution that Andrew Hugel and I devised was to record the work binaurally. If you're not sure what binaural recording is, it's a method of capturing sound environments very accurately. For instance, if you listen to the sounds of cars in the street, record that binaurally, and go into a very quiet room, you can recreate that sound of cars so precisely that it sounds as if you're standing outside again. The other advantage of binaural sound is that you can create really complex 3D sound and audio environments. Sound that appears to emanate from behind your head or above and below, which is very difficult to achieve normally. When you listen to any recorded music, it tends to just be left and right. So for Secret Garden, the use of binaural recording allows us to accurately represent, through sound, the entrance of new participants to the work. And this diagram, I hope, will explain a little what we're trying to do. So there's 10 iPads here, and each iPad has a different poem or song attached to it, of course. There's someone standing on iPad 1, that yellow one on the left there. Now we'll hear the song tied to iPad 5, which is just at the bottom, in their right ear. It'll also be just behind their head as well. So if you're standing at iPad 1 and someone is standing at iPad 5, you can almost feel their presence. The effect, of course, when all 10 people in the room is this highly immersive 3D sound environment that's for each participant. The challenge of that, of course, is there's 10 different positions. It is a challenge, believe me. It was a big challenge. And for every single iPad position, you essentially need an independent mix. So the person at iPad 1, for example, needs to hear the song attached to iPad 2 in their right ear. However, a guy at iPad 5 needs to hear the song attached to iPad 2 in their left ear. It becomes quite complex. So to achieve this, I visited a museum space in Leicester. This is a beautiful space. It's the Newark Museum, for people who have been to Leicester. I know, I've got a nod from Kevin there. Leicester. Yeah, it's got a really nice reverberant quality to it. The sound is beautiful when you're in there, and even if you're just walking and talking, it sounds fantastic. So I set up an array of 10 speakers in an arrangement that's similar to, what's actually exactly the same as the arrangement that's upstairs, the iPad arrangement upstairs. And we placed this dummy head, you can see in the foreground there, right in the centre of the room, and then recorded the songs, or every single song in every single position using this dummy head, which has a microphone in each ear. So it's capturing sound as if you were the dummy head, if you were there. This actually resulted in 100 sound files that need to be processed and mixed in bespoke software to achieve the sonic environment that is experienced when you're engaging with the work. So the result of the motion capture, the binaural sound design, and the iPad interactions is the installation here at Mocha. Our collaborative team do, however, have plans to adapt the work further as a mobile experience. And this will involve tying each song to a specific location in a city. So when a user enters a particular location, a particular place, their iOS device or Android device will deliver the song to them. This realization will also have an augmented reality element that uses the device's camera and screen to superimpose our digital Adam and Eve onto the real streets of the city. So we'll replace our Eden of trees, flowers, snakes and apples with houses and billboards, motorcycles and people. Let's see how that goes. I think that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay, the images in my installation are not from the exuberant carnivals of Trinidad or Rio de Janeiro, but the sometimes grey-skied, rain-soaked dullness and sudden bursts of sunshine of an English summer. London buzzes, as London always does, but an even bigger buzz is about to hit the August bank holiday Monday in an area of the city called Notting Hill. Sexuality, sensuality, and sensors at street level. The sensors of 500,000 digital cameras, iPads and camera phones accompany the dancers. Sensors and cell phones. I like the image that conjures up. Each person a sensor and a cell, communicating, newly excited synaptic connections, forming new social neural pathways, ever creating an organism that seems absurdly impossible to explain or contain. A hybrid cultural extravaganza of fantasies and dreams, realized through 2 days of exuberant expression. A multicultural phenomena reflecting the movements of people across continents. Yet I cannot help reflect how this digital web of communication and recording itself influences the ways in which people behave. There is a new structure to the event, a new information structure that impacts on the active serendipity of the pre-mobile era, a new priority to performance that places visibility above feeling, the imperative to be seen above sensuality, a mass manifestation of emergent information networks. I completely lost my place where I am here, that brings us to another level of humans being. Carnival. It began and still begins with containment. The fantasies are collective expressions written large through the combination of costume, music, sculptural forms and dance. It takes time, effort and discipline to prepare to perform. In the early stages, these performances are subject to a process of adjudication and award. It's a highly competitive and collaborative environment. I'm reminded somehow of the temple processions I've seen here in Taiwan. Certainly the origins of carnival have roots in religion too. Minds and hearts contained by a uniform belief system that is momentarily released in an anarchic way on the eve of the Christian religious period of Lent. Lent, a time of discipline and austerity for 1 month of observance. A period that begins with collective forms of extravagance in many cultures around the world. Carnival, where European tradition meets emerging New World release and freedoms, emancipation from slavery, resurgence of African spirituality and custom, a fusion of music, indigenous belief, and celebration. Carnival is a dreaming place for the imagination that builds over time. And Carnival is a release from containment on the eve of containment's renewal. The biggest carnival in Europe spills out 1 million bodies across the streets and pavements of Notting Hill in London. All of the world is there to disturb the peace, disturb the commonplace with something vibrant, colourful, joyous, noisy, creative, and bacchanalian. And now, it is something instantly communicated around the world. There may be 1 million bodies on the streets, but the images from it may now reach 1 billion eyes, even before the day is out. Perhaps we might consider it the biggest digital arts event in Western Europe. Technologies are more than a preoccupation with the creation of artifacts and the means to enable them to operate. They also represent structured ways in which human interactions may be organized towards a purpose. One of the most ancient and richly diverse forms of human-based interactive technologies is that of ritual. One could argue that the very concepts of humanism and post-humanism arise from abilities to abstract, enabled through ritual, and that intellectual debates have fundamentally expanded ritualistic encounters of disembodied thought. And like poetry, it comes from around the campfire. Pragmatism, pluralism, humanism, dynamism, feudalism, pessimism, rationalism, rheumatism, unionism, euphemism, shamanism, creationism, organism, communism, nationalism, patriotism, feminism, dualism, journalism, formalism, paternalism, dogmatism, paganism, postmodernism, populism, traditionalism, racialism, synergism, futurism, tokenism, colonialism, conservatism, liberalism, materialism, symbolism, terrorism, altruism, barbarism, cynicism, modernism, positivism, relativism, egotism, evangelism, fatalism, pacifism. Man, there are so many isms, we make them into prisons. Just give me some reason for remind me of the optimism. How does Carnival reflect the post-humanist perspective? How does my identity relate to something that originates in other cultures but has been so visibly expressed for 50 years of my own? And therein lies the most complicated question of all. What is my culture in a culture where individualism is valued above collectivism? What is this idea of an identity that connects serially with others but needs no definite name? Carnival is a collective experience, a ritual and journey of flesh and bone, spirit and emotion, an expanded mentality of a moment in the planned calendar of the year, where the usual bounds of human behavior give way to the release of new energies, to things that would not be acceptable in everyday life. Forgive my Italian here. There are two ideas on the origins of the word carnival. One is that the name comes from the Italian carne levare, meaning to remove meat, for Lent. Others suggest that the word comes from carne valle, which means farewell to meat. Carne may also be translated as flesh, and various folk interpretations suggest carne valle as a farewell to the flesh. For some celebrants of Carnival, this implies letting go of a known and everyday inhibited self and embracing the freedoms of festivity. In many ways, the power of the image in the digital age is increasing. The power of image making. Digitally rendered images shot 1 million times a second and shared across the world, and countless moving images step us up as individuals, increase our independence from the power of images mediated externally by powerful corporate interests, at the same time as those interests themselves vie for increasingly scientific approaches to manipulate us otherwise. Yet let's consider, how does this freedom, if it is a freedom, shape us? Our thoughts, our social interactivity, our feelings, our sense of culture and identity. How does it change our physicality in the world? And we must also ask, how does it contain us? Beyond the flesh, the boundaries of exposure and behavior are transcended for a few hours in an outrage of music, costumes, dance, and rhythmic body contact between friends, acquaintances, and complete strangers. Yet it begins in the contained and disciplined passage of carnival dancers and sculptural creations past a panel of judges, a competition to see who has prepared most imaginatively, skillfully, and best. The reputations of artists, designers, musicians, community leaders, and performers rest upon this early adjudication. Perhaps we will see competitive virtual carnival competitions in the future. Are there people even now developing the computer-generated carnival environment to act this out beyond the flesh, in another sense, worldwide. The digital vehicle may provide all the excitement future generations crave. Perhaps we need to ask why the majority of dancers in Taipei's recent Dream Parade were older people. Bump and grind. It can be rough sex with a gentle heart, retro-heterosexuality, stimulated, simulated, mixed with new and multi-gendered combinations as the bindings of normality unravel to the supranormal carnival heartbeat of the city. I'm reminded of my dance work with Gabriel Roth many years ago, musician, dancer, actor, shaman, who encountered the great minds of the human potential and consciousness movement at Big Sur, and reminded them that they were not just heads on sticks, but had bodies that could move. I'm almost tempted to ask everybody to stand up for a minute. Maybe you could do that. And maybe without music, and just with a moment of music in your own mind, you could just move your body to whatever rhythm it is that takes you at the moment. That could be stillness, it could be staccato, it could be chaotic, it could be rolling, rolling, rolling. Okay. I'm a great movement observer. I love to observe people's movements, and 20 years training of looking at other people move. So I clocked so many things just then. Bump and grind, linear and circular movements, direct and gentle, rising to chaotic interplay, rising to lyrical joyous conclusion, the stillness of two bodies, briefly joined, punctuated by parting smiles. All of these contacts are very momentary. They're between strangers often, not by people who know each other. They're initiated by men, and they're initiated by women. Eclectic electric beats play Pied Piper with the populace, cloned in costume, cloned in movement, step by arm-waving step, a two-human machine to be cyborg for too long. They break. Boys, I girls, I boys. The dancer and the watcher fraternize below the waist. Powerful women and groups of women show who's boss. No need to construct or manipulate the image. The photographer dances too or is destroyed. The only post-human things in sight are 500,000 image-making devices, the biggest digital arts event in Europe. 300 million images reduce the heat of human desire to frozen hips, two-dimensional lips. Frozen hips, two-dimensional lips. Image making reduces the heat of human desire. Yet in these hyper-visual times, the trend is for image making to stimulate and stoke the fires of desire, is it not? Frozen hips and two-dimensional lips, eyes and body shapes that invite. The sexuality and sensuality of an advertising image, somehow more acceptable than what happens on the street. Beyond the flesh, beyond the meat, beyond the flesh-to-flesh gyrations of the street. Bump and grind, simulated penetration and counter-penetration, slow and grinding, hard and vigorous, the invitingly consensual and the unwittingly entrapped. Some guys end up getting far more than they bargained for. Women, here and there, enact a powerful collective domination over men, especially those men foolish enough to too openly hunt for contact. Photographers and filmmakers are welcomed voyeurs of these acts. Is the dance now enacted for the camera as much for the contact with the other? Post-human sexuality. A woman on a mobile phone bumps and grinds and bumps, still talking to someone distant, half engaged. And when she feels his rising urge, she turns and dominates him with the power of her hips and leaves him with a tiny kiss. Our human and cyborg sexual identities boldly shift in many ways. In this one work, I wanted to show and share the sociographical and technologically altered reality of an aspect of human behavior, an urban disconnect from the bodies we once inhabited and touched so fully, a diluted cultural manifestation further fragmented by new externalities. For me, it visually links to a record of an embodied sexual spirituality revealed in the mid-1970s photographs of adolescent courtship dances by Leni Riefenstahl in her book, The People of Cow. Here, the sensuous and rhythmic movements of these naked young women are more than enough to excite the passions of the young men they dance before. But the men look to the ground, in theory. Occasionally an eye pops from behind a hand. But the sight before them is difficult to ignore. The women approach the men and choose a partner, dancing into direct contact with them. Yet this is not just sexual provocation, but both the choosing of a partner and the training of a warrior, the building of a social set of relationships through a new ritual or rite of passage into full adulthood, not just for the individual, but within and for the whole collective identity of the tribe. Is this what monocultural carnivals do on a mass scale? Not all involve the provocations and gyrations of Notting Hill, for sure. The sexuality may be masked, literally, and refined to an extraordinary degree, posturing rather than pounding, as they say up north in the UK. For some, the carnival may constitute an annually and society-sanctioned rite of passage. For others, it is the structured bringing together of the tribe and the multiplicity of modern tribes to common purpose and to renew society itself. But it is also profoundly fragmented by the complexities of a contemporary sense of self and community. So again, to that difficult question, what is my culture and my cultural identity in increasingly diverse environments of expectation and experience? A Taiwanese national who came to the carnival with me a couple of years ago reflected on their experience of carnival in London, beginning with a comparison of their experience of life in Taiwan. I was born in a conservative family, and my personality is more introvert, so that my emotions are contained. Perhaps most Taiwanese are not good at expressing their thinking so freely due to the concept of respecting seniors or the limits of morality in our culture. We usually express our emotion carefully, but not directly. Compared to the people in the carnival, Taiwanese are soft, gentle and humble, not very tough and wild. In the carnival, people are very open and feel natural to show their bodies. Women can dress very sexily and colourfully, and they don't care if their figure is perfect. Her further impressions of the carnival itself. The carnival is full of luxurious processions, brimming with happy and enthusiastic people. Strong rhythms began the carnival with a theme and a taste of Brazilian culture. When we walked towards the middle area of the procession, we saw the streets were full of people. The whole town turned out for the spectacle. As the day progressed, everywhere was in a mess and full of garbage. People were dancing, singing, drinking, talking, and making noise. Very crazy. We went through the crowded street. It was like escaping a disaster. The scene made me think about the end of the world. Even though I could see the police stood everywhere, it was still out of control. I was so shocked. It was an eye-opener. When black people dance, they like to raise and shake their buttocks very quickly. The dance style is amazing and very sexy. I just couldn't take my eyes off some girls when they just shook their buttocks. I think it's difficult. Everybody seems like they can dance and play music. Even when they were talking, it looked like a kind of dance. Big trucks were full of people, full of young people dancing and playing music. They seemed never feeling tired, even though it was hot. Some women and men danced with their buttocks and other parts touching. It induced me to think about sex. They were very open and crazy. They were not only born to be dancers, but it's their life, their culture. It seemed whatever you can do whatever you want here. I saw many strange ways in which people were dressed. A lady was drunk and lay on the street and peed in her pants. I wanted to dance too, but I was too shy. Maybe I needed many good friends to dance with me at that moment. I really hope that I can dance like them. If the world is going to end soon, what would you like to do? I think to do something that is your ultimate desire. Maybe it's just like the scene of carnival. People are so wild and crazy. My culture. Am I held in by social sanction, to express myself ritualistically throughout the year with others in prescribed ways? Or am I free to choose a completely individualistically orientated path through life? Or are you, somewhere in between, partially beyond the flesh, or even in this digital age, partially beyond the reason for flesh? How does and how will Carnival reflect this transformation of human experience? I am old enough to have been alive when the first London Caribbean Carnival formed nearly 50 years ago. The changes, challenges, confusions and impacts on consistency are enough to fill a library. For the moment, on the streets of London, what happens beyond and between the flesh is all too real, and in this moment. It's written there in the languages of difference and commonality. Move those hips, bump and grind him, kiss your lips. Move those hips, bumper, grind him, kiss your lips. Move those hips, bumper, grind him, kiss your lips. Move those hips, bumper, grind him, kiss your lips. My wife is from West Indies, lived a lot of her life in the West Indies. So I've kind of grown up with West Indian patois around me, and apologies for my particular renditions of it.
Right. Thank you very much for Kevin's very interesting paper. That actually reminds me of some Taoist parade in Taiwan. And it's not a question, just a very short comment, but not even a comment, just mention it very briefly. Just remind me of Taoist parade in Taiwan, that sometimes it could be a bit sexual and digitalized. Yeah, but anyway, let's move.
Something that someone told me, a friend told me recently, about her grandfather's 80th birthday party. And there's a tradition, I think it's a rural tradition, that, and it also happens at funerals, that strippers are employed to come to those events, either to remind an older person that of what may be past for them, or to remind someone who's dead what they're missing in the future, which, you know, for me is quite extraordinary. As extraordinary as some of the reactions I've seen to the people dancing, the photographs of people dancing in this room. Cultural difference.
Hello. My presentation is going to be a little bit less formal. I don't have a paper, but I hope that you enjoy it anyway. Thank you so much for having me here, Ming, and to the whole staff of MoCA for making this installation possible. I had countless volunteers who were absolutely incredible. I can't believe the work ethic and the meticulousness of the people of Taiwan. The students were fantastic to work with, so thank you very much. So I like to start my presentations with an image that I made when I was an undergraduate at Brown University in the United States. My work began as an exploration of sexuality. From there, I began to look at pornography and think about children's toys. Here you see men's bodies abstracted into penises and women's bodies abstracted into little bits and pieces. From there, I began to make full-body costumes superimposed into digital landscapes. This piece is called The Wrath. And then I moved to Chicago. That was kind of the first thing that happened. And I began to explore the world around me in a variety of different ways. These are different things that I started pulling into my work. And I make works on paper as well. This is 20 by 26 inches, and it's a combination of everything that you saw in the image before. So an Nkisi mask, gas masks, American flags, African-American collectibles, watermelons, Takashi Murakami paintings, all sorts of things were being combined and reassembled into my landscape. From the two-dimensional, I quickly moved into the three-dimensional and made costumes. that were presented in storefront window displays in Chicago's Michigan Avenue. Michigan Avenue is a major commercial thoroughfare in Chicago. And I began collaborating with performers and also large-scale sculpture makers. This piece is called Pleasure Center, and it's a large-scale inflatable where people signed away their bodies and then took on a new body. And from taking on their new body, they were allowed entry into a new world. When they entered this new world, they began to experiment with their new bodies with someone called a pleasure being. Here's a detail shot of the inflatable. Someone transforming their body. And the pleasure being in the center of the inflatable. So once these new bodies were put on, people could interface with one another in new ways. There were electronic vibrators inside of their costumes and magnets, and so they could vibrate one another through a semi-permeable membrane. From collaboration came the ability to kind of expand my vision into large-scale installation. This piece is called Love Monster and is inspired in part by looking at and reading psychoanalytic theory. The Love Monster was incorporated into a lovescape and shown as a kind of children's landscape permeated by a variety of hypersexualized toys. These are the tricksters. 3 Christmas reindeer were transformed into these 3-seated figures. The sweethearts, 2 lovers are attached by an umbilical tongue, and they intermittently fight one another and hold one another, and they're blind in these heart-shaped costumes. From Chicago, I moved to Pastoral, Maine, where I attended a residency called Skowhegan. What I find is that the landscape very much inspires and transforms my practice. And so as I was making in Pastoral, Maine, the landscape began to impact my visual palette. Paradise Imagine was presented at the MCA in Chicago as the first solo show that I did in a museum. 2 performing figures at first were separated, and then they opened themselves up, sewed themselves together, and then were forced to negotiate the world as a single entity. From Pastoral, Maine, I moved to Brazil. So this really is where I kind of think my practice as a professional artist very much begins. Everything else before was kind of an experiment, and I started to incorporate ideas of masquerade, performativity, and also the fact that I'm Black, white, and Japanese. I'm African American, European American, and Japanese. My mother's a Japanese immigrant, and that kind of experience of hybridity very much informs my experience as an artist. I first made this fictional vision of paradise when I was not living in pastoral Brazil. I then began to attempt to document the world around me. And of course, this also is a representational system. It's not something that accurately depicts the landscape, but I tried to kind of more accurately represent something from looking and attempting to represent. This was our home. My husband's an anthropologist. He studies northeastern Brazil. He studies Afro-Brazilian populations in northeastern Brazil. And so I very much was inspired in part by his ethnographic methods. He was on a Fulbright to study, and I applied for a Fulbright and received one as well to study folkloric performance traditions while I was in northeastern Brazil. And so I began to look at the ways that others had attempted to represent the people of Brazil. The painting on the right is a Dutch painting of a Tupi Indian woman with her child, and the painting on the left is my representation of that painting, a kind of carnivalesque Carmen Miranda in a landscape that I was attempting to represent from the place. Of course, both are inaccurate representations of the place. They are only human representations through our perceptions. Mine, of course, is is much more fantastical. I was also looking at Bumba Meu Boi, which is a folkloric performance tradition in northeastern Brazil, in which Afro-Brazilians perform a a story, I guess, and this is where storytelling begins in my work. A slave steals the tongue of a bull from his master to give to his pregnant wife. The wife desires this tongue because it will feed the child. The master then decides that the slave must die. And somehow the bull comes back to life. And so this is a celebration of the reanimation of life and the savior of the slave by this animal. I then began to incorporate that into my own vision. I started to absorb, right? So my practice is very much about moving from place to place and attempting to absorb a place and not necessarily become a place, but bring parts of that place into my practice so that my practice is deeply responsive to that place. I then started looking at my own North American mythologies, folk mythologies, and I found a half-black, half-white topsy-turvy doll. This half-black, half-white topsy-turvy doll became the impetus for a new body of work. I had the opportunity to show at PS1 MoMA in 2005, and so I first made my own version of this topsy-turvy doll, and then made an enormous version of the topsy-turvy doll, and 2 costume figures that were based on Yoruba ancestral worship costumes began to play with, tear apart, and love this enormous representation of the binarized racial representations in the United States. This is the Winter Garden Hybrid Love Objects installation at PS1. So in 2006, I came back to the United States. I'd lived in Brazil for 2 years and was ready to kind of really re-immerse myself in the logic of my home country. I began to do the Whitney Independent Study Program. And through thinking with the people in the program, I began to think about what a utopia would look like. I mean, there was so much kind of criticism, right? We were thinking about critical frameworks and deconstructing things and critiquing papers. And I wanted to kind of think through that, how I might contribute a potential utopian world. And so I constructed this utopia. And I constructed the utopia with an anthropologist. I worked with Rachel Lears, who's an ethnographic filmmaker, for 2 years, from 2006 to 2008, to document a fictional future world called No Place, based on Thomas More's Utopia. We did this by inviting people to the studio. So people would come to the studio, immerse themselves in the logic of the place, and then they would put on costumes and tell us stories. They would tell us stories about their lives. And so we were using ethnographic methods to take the stories of these people and integrate them into the logic of this utopian place. This was the portal to No Place, constructed out of recycled materials. A utopia vendor who sold tourist trinkets to No Place on the streets of Jamaica, Queens. A cartography of No Place based on the 7 ancient wonders of the world. And the first No Place installation. This is called Self and Landscape. This installation was constructed by a woman who facilitates the birthing of babies coming to my studio, and we talked to her about how babies are born. And so through the process of learning about her experiences as a doula, we decided the first chapter of Ethnography of No Place would be about the reproductive cycles of the people of this world. The people of no place are part plant and part human, and they change gender and color, and they turn back into the landscape when they die. Of course, no place is an impossible place. It's not an actual location. And basically, the installations were not things that people could access unless they were invited to participate inside of the contours of the installations. This was my studio at the Studio Museum in Harlem in New York. I was an artist in residence there from 2007 to 2008. And much of the ethnography of No Place was shot inside of this installation. This is myself and anthropologist Rachel Lears as psychedelic naturalists. We shot these photos in Kmart, which is a kind of like American Walmart thing, you know. And here are some stills from the ethnography. If you go online on Vimeo, you can find excerpts from ethnography of No Place. We documented their life cycle, their how they die, how they exchange symbolic language, and there are sections in the ethnographic film that even reflect the voice of the ethnographer. This piece was very much about someone from the outside attempting to represent an inside. And so the voice is the voice of an ethnographer, the voice of someone who is not a part of the culture, but is attempting to represent it, and actually recognizing her own foibles and her own inability to completely represent that place. Stills from Self and Landscape. Death and Kin. And the ancestors of the No-Placians were the people from the Winter Garden Hybrid Love Objects performance that I had produced for PS1 MoMA. So this is another part of my process, is now, because it's become this kind of ever-evolving narrative structure, the people of No Place, the empathics that you see upstairs, have a history, right? They have a history of their own culture. And so the ancestors actually were a part of a prior project. I'm very much interested in kind of creating a history, a present, and a future, and thinking through all of these temporalities in order to accurately represent an impossible to represent accurately world. These are the No-Placians in their adolescent form, and a No-Placian anatomy. So this obviously has had many iterations, and from projecting this future utopia, I began to think about what it means for people in the present to attempt to become people of a future world. And so in 2009, I began the Empathics Project. The first iteration of the Empathics Project was with dancers at the University of Buffalo. I was an artist in residence there. And then I presented it as a part of Performa, which is a performance biennial in New York. So collaboratively, we began to think about what it meant to attempt to become these people, right? And the dancers and I, over 6 weeks, produced a ritual of the Empathics. I then presented not only the ritual, but the finding of the Empathics, which is this kind of No-Placian culture, at Tufts University. I began to lead tours of the exhibitions as an ethnographer. I was speaking with biologists at Tufts University to attempt to construct how people of the present could become like the people of this future world, and began to create videos to represent that. These are some stills from a video of the Empathics biological mutation. I then went to Real Artways in Hartford, Connecticut, and created this room for collaboration. At the beginning of a 6-week residency, the room was completely empty. Well, not entirely, but mostly. And over that time, I worked with dancers and neuroscientists to imagine empathic culture. There's a repository for empathic culture called the instituteofempathy.org online, where you can find the research of the empathics. And then I had a solo museum show, and I love this picture because it really kind of tells you a lot about museums. This European neoclassical framework for the construction of knowledge. Georgia O'Keeffe was having a show at the same time, and she actually, the presentation of her work was of her paintings of Native American objects. And so I decided that my work was going to respond to that and the Montclair Art Museum's Native American collection. So the first installation you see here, there's this large sculpture in the first room of my project. And so what I did was I created a shawl for her to incorporate her into this installation. And I put bones into the alcoves of the architecture. On the left side, you see a blue didactic, and on the right side, you see a gray didactic. The blue didactics were written by the empathics to tell the story of their Institute of Empathy. The gray didactics were written by the museum curator to tell the story of my exhibition. And as you move through the exhibition, there were a number of dioramas, and each diorama told you a little bit more about empathic culture. The first physical manifestation of becoming an empathic is to develop a second head. And the second head contains competing information from the first head. And so a process called utopia conjuring therapy has to happen in order for these people to actually combine the two competing sets of information. Utopia conjuring therapy creates visionary painting, and so the empathics manifest their hybridity through these visionary paintings. Here's a detail shot of one. So they're kind of Tibetan Buddhist mandala paintings and Playboy bunnies and botanical illustration and African textiles as well as Japanese textiles and yoga poses. So it's really kind of just an amalgam of just about anything, just smashed together. Actually, I should probably take that back. It's not really anything because actually everything was made in response to place, right? So I was asked to be in a Playboy show, and so I made a piece in response to this theme. And then I was asked to be an artist in residence at the Newark Museum, and they have this incredible collection of Tonka paintings, and so I started incorporating that into the work as well. So there's always this responsiveness to place. This piece is called Eye Body. And another installation shot. Blossoming. So once the competing sets of information, it has become kind of unified in the empathics, they shed their second heads and develop petal-covered wings. Here you see a reconstruction of their Institute of Empathy, where they're practicing utopia conjuring therapy. Not only do they shed their second heads, but they also shed their skins. And they sell these things to perpetuate the research of their institute. A video of utopia conjuring therapy. And some stills. On the left, you see a junior empathic, and on the right, a senior empathic. This piece is called Blossoming Aerial Display. Oh, I'm sorry, it's actually called Star Compulsion. So each object is also a costume, so everything actually can be performed, and that's really important to me, that they're not just virtual objects, they're objects that real humans can actually interact with and perform and play within. We did a performance in the installation where someone led people through the Institute of Empathy's findings and then presented utopian conjuring therapy as a dance. I also did a planetarium show as a part of the exhibition at the Newark Museum. These are just some stills from the planetarium show. I'm just going to kind of quickly go through those. And so upstairs you see Chimera. Chimera is a mythological beast, part woman, part animal, but also a kind of genetic designation of something that is multiple. Apparently, many pregnant women are chimeras because they have the genetic material of their children within their bodies. So now, I'm working on a project called Chimatech. Oh, there are a lot of typos in this one. 2013, maybe it's not a typo. Maybe it shouldn't be. And now we're in the future. You know, I put these in here because it's what I'm working on now, and it's very much in process. This is a large-scale steel sculpture at Franconia Sculpture Park in Schaefer, Minnesota. And I think of it as a site for some sort of performance. I'm working with Ron Eglash, who's an ethnomathematician, to kind of think about how Chimatech could be developed. Since the empathics were selling their hides in sheds in order to perpetuate the research of their institute, and I was thinking about them as a research institute, a nonprofit hub, I started thinking that it might be interesting to produce home use technologies that people could actually use to hybridize their bodies. Ron and I are kind of hashing out the details of this now, trying to figure it all out. This is the most recent iteration of Chimatech. This woman DJ kind of mixes the interior of this costume figure's body as she listens to the music of DJ Spooky, somebody who has been deeply influential in kind of thinking through hybridity. And these are some stills of a collecting expedition that the empathics are going to go on this summer to fuel their machines. So I'm going to quickly do I have enough time to show a quick video?
express this. Oh, there's a microphone. Okay. Actually, this is very, very, very inspiring. I mean, I've been around for a while, many different exhibits within and out of Asia for the past 5-6 years. But this is something incredible because I had a similar, I thought, and especially with your colors, that there's like something called synesthesia. I don't know if you've heard of it. And it's something that it's like I've been looking forward to, that somebody else would also come out with what I also have been envisioning, which is the ability to express some kind of hybridity through colors, that if sound was color, how would we see that? So I thought, wow, like, what if that existed somewhere out there? And then you just played this video, and I was just stunned. I was like, it's a compliment more than a question. Okay. So thank you for showing that. It's beautiful.
Oh yes, there's a question from Lee.
我要用中文问哦，就是沙雅昨天他在讲到一个那个 self label 的事情。那 self label 就是自己为自己定义。然后他昨天有提到一个问题是说，因为为什么有时候自己需要帮 self label， 是因为别人给你的 label 不一定是正确的。那这个问题其实延伸到我看 Kevin 的作品的时候，当他在呈现一个 Caribbean 的文化的 culture 的时候，以一个并不是说他一定是个外来者，而是说他是不是身为一个艺术家，他会有一些顾虑，他不能够完全的呈现这个文化呢？或者是他以一个外来者的角度，或许他有一些这个叫做 misrepresentation， 就是对于一个新的就是说可能会有一些他怎么样去处理这个比较敏感的问题，就是当你去 present 另外一个文化。Did I make myself clear?
So is the question to Saya and Kevin, or just Kevin?
I think for me the question is it my culture? Yeah? Whose culture is it? I wear a band around my wrist. This band is given to me every year by an Indian woman who lives in my town because she considers me her brother. And when I first went to live in the town where I live, within the first couple of days there's the sound of drumming coming from a Christian church across the road. I've lived there 30 years. Yeah? Across the road, I go into the church and there are hundreds and hundreds of people in brightly coloured saris dancing around a structure in the middle of a Christian church, which is a shrine to the goddess. And for 8-9 days they dance around this. The men dance around and women dance around, and on the last day they succeed in vanquishing a demon. And within a couple of days I was dancing with them. Yeah? And so for 30 years, in the town where I live, I celebrate with Indian people. I associate with Muslims from Bangladesh. I live in a family that's partly African Caribbean. I live in a town where there are many Chinese people, and there's the influence of that culture. So all of those combinations of cultures, who is it that is going to represent that culture? But all of the people that are in it. And most of my work is not, most of my life's work as an artist has been about engaging with people to answer those questions and to give them expression and voice. Not as a kind of selfish artist, but as an unselfish artist in that sense. And I've got to an age where I want to be able to express myself. So these are all questions for me. Working directly in India, I made a film for Indian independence. Over a successive period of time, I realized how much I wouldn't have known and how much I would have misrepresented the culture that I was making that film with if I'd have done it at the beginning. and it only worked because it was a fully and truly collaborative event between many hundreds of people in the end. It's not my voice, it is the combination of many voices.
Well, I mean, I obviously have opted to create another culture. And that's that I can misrepresent and properly represent and make completely up, and yeah, so I've attempted to avoid that in some way. I mean, I can talk about it a bit from a personal experience. One is that I grew up black, white, and Japanese, but I grew up in a very white environment, a white Jewish American environment. And, because of that, I spent the first, 10 years thinking I was Japanese, and then the next 10 years thinking I was white, and then I spent the last 10 years thinking I'm black. So it's and none of them ever think I'm them. So it's always very complicated trying to represent these things. But from looking at Kevin's work, I mean, what is interesting to me is, there are two things. The first is there's this overt sexuality that you're focusing on in the work, and I wonder from a Taiwanese perspective what that does in your understanding of what blackness is, what Africanness is, or what that looks like. Because, blackness is often represented as a kind of lascivious, desiring body. And, I stand here as a black woman, not being a lascivious, desiring body. And I hope you take that away as well, not only a vision of desire. But on another note, my husband is an anthropologist, and he's white, and he studies Afro-Brazilians. And through being in his research site for 2 years and watching him become friends with and become, literally become a member of a community with all of its hierarchies and with all of its white love, he very much represents a culture as his friends. They're his friends and his family. So there's that too. It's important that we don't create these boundaries so that people can't represent things. So I think that's kind of my answer to that question.
I think we'll never have enough time, so should we just call it an end and let's enjoy our lunch break. So if you have any questions, let's just discuss through your lunch break then. Shall we come back about 2? Yeah, 2 o'clock exactly, not about 2 o'clock exactly. I'll see you later.